My PhD topic is the multimodal analysis of functional connectivity changes in post-stroke patients with disorders of consciousness. My name is Danuta Szirmai, and I'm a neurologist resident in the National Institute of Mental Health, Neurology, and Neurosurgery. My vision is to provide the best care for patients in coma and disorders of consciousness, and I aim to do this by using neurophysiology and precision medicine in this patient group. So I had 4 projects ongoing in the last 1.5 years. And I've mainly finished the first 2 ones, so I will talk about the 3rd and the 4th project in more words. My 3rd project is about assessing the prognostic power of EEG measures in patients with disorders of consciousness. But what are these disorders of consciousness? They are temporary states on the continuum of consciousness, which are the minimally conscious state and the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. If they last for more than a month, we call them prolonged or chronic disorders of consciousness. And they are relatively rare diseases, but as healthcare improves, more and more patients are being treated. Now, this is the really difficult questions that the clinicians face who are treating these patients. Are you sure that he will not recover? And answering this question is really hard, since we know that late recovery can happen even 1 year after the brain injury in 10–24% of the cases. And now this unknown prognosis can either lead to suboptimal treatment and the withdrawal of the treatment, or the unnecessary prolongation of life support. So what can we use as prognostic markers? There are the clinical measures, the behavioral scales, the golden standard, the coma recovery scale revised that they use, or we can use EEG measures such as qualitative markers, which are basically visually assessed EEG markers, quantitative markers, or functional connectivity markers. Functional connectivity markers are the most difficult computational method between the 3, and the qualitative markers are the ones that are more time consuming, then there is a bigger need for human resources and well-trained personnel. So our clinical question was if EEG markers are better in the prognostication in patients with DOC compared to clinical measures. And their hypothesis was that yes, they perform better, and that the quantitative markers will perform better than the qualitative measures that we assess. We hope that our results will have the clinical and also the rehabilitative decision-making, and to help the communication with patients' family. We ended up with 74 articles, but only 22 were eligible for all the data. The other authors have not responded, or we didn't have all the data from the articles. These are the preliminary results, the main results of the meta-analysis about the diagnostic accuracy of the prediction of the recovery. The effect measure was the R/under curve. And we could see that between the EEG measures, the best AUC was of the connectivity measures with 82%. The qualitative and the quantitative measures were the same, 77%, while the CRSR scale, the behavioral scale, performed a 71% diagnostic accuracy. What we could see is that all of the assessed methods showed a fairly good prognosticability, above 70%. And that was a significant difference between the CRSR scale, the clinical scale, and the EEG methods, but the non-significant difference between the EEG methods themselves. So what we could conclude is that although visual EEG assessment can be time-consuming and expensive, we would encourage to use any kind of EEG markers in the prognostication or in this patient group. But what we would encourage more is to do ongoing advancement and ongoing innovation for developing so-called user-friendly tools, so doctors can use EEG analysis without knowing and using the computation behind. My second study is a validation study, a diagnostic accuracy study of the Hungarian version of the coma recovery scale revised. So we have translated this scale, which is a behavioral scale composed of 23 items. And we did it because we know that the misdiagnosis of this patient can be really high as 38% when it's done by a bedside visit by clinicians. And the prognosis of the minimal conscious state patients are always better than the vegetative state or the unresponsive wakefulness patients. And this is a precise tool in diagnosing this so-called non-obvious behavior or covert consciousness. the aim of the study would be to determine the diagnostic test accuracy of the Hungarian version, and also to determine the inter-rater and the intra-rater reliability of the test. It would be a multicentric prospective study, and we would include adult patients either in the acute or in the chronic phase with DOC. Now, the clinical implication is not only to help clinicians to diagnose precisely these patients, but also this would be the first available behavioral scale to do objective follow-up of these patients, which is important for the rehabilitation and their outcome as well. So we finished with the language validation part of the process, the translation, and now we are moving on to the validation part. I already involved the different centers, and we are going on with the ethical approval of the study. My first project that is already under review at the Journal of Helion, the scope of the project is really similar to my third project, where it's just a smaller scope study. The rationale behind is the same. In this study, we could prove that EEG connectivity markers are much better than the CRSR scale, and we could also show that AI tools, automated outcome prediction methods, outperform the existing other measures that we have assessed. The second study that I've joined in Belgium, Liège, for 3 months is another meta-analysis that they have conducted on neuroimaging and neurophysiological alterations in disorders of consciousness. Now, the rationale behind this study was that the differentiation between these different states is still difficult, and so we need accurate biomarkers to do it so objectively. And without going into the details, we have found that there is a significant difference in neurophysiological markers between the patient groups that can successfully differentiate these patient groups, but there is a huge heterogeneity between the assessed EEG measures, so there's a need for standardization in this field as well. So this is the overview of my studies, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Danuta, for the presentation. I find your topics really interesting. So I actually have 2 questions. One of them is, you found an importance for the visual inspection of EEG, and you mentioned also the difficulty of this in terms of manpower and time consumed. There is a lot of movement toward AI, especially for the visual areas. So that's the first part we think AI can contribute to. What do you think is the potential there for EEG?
Well, I think that there is not so much potential for the visual assessment of the EEG using AI measures, but the quantitative part, because, well, but everything that we see on the EEG becomes translated as a quantitative measure, especially when you are using AI. There are some efforts, but as in my first study, I didn't have time to say that we have not enough data to prove its superiority. It's because there is always this lack of, so what we call is overfitting of the AI method that is used in the study. So they overfit it on their own data, and then they do not use it on another kind of data. And so we always see at the end that the overfitting is still a big problem, and because of which we cannot really use these AI methods yet.
And do you think there's going to be a solution to that?
Yes, more research in AI. And yeah, just more sharing data between laboratories is the most important, so they can use the already existing AI methods in another kind of big pool of data, so they can prove if it's really working or it's just overfitting of the data.
Thank you. My second question is actually about your project on the Hungarian validation study. Do you think there would be any international interest in this, or is this mostly to further the Hungarian state of affairs?
Yes, we have been thinking about that. It's only Hungarian, since it's the Hungarian translation of the scale that we want to validate. It's an important question for Hungary, since we are like 10, 15 years late compared to other European countries. I think that's a long time, since we don't have this scale. So yeah, we have to do this.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have just a quick question. What's your recommendation when we should perform EEG on these patients? In the acute phase, chronic phase, it might have an impact on the results?
Yes, well, it's a difficult question. We would like to do the subgroup analysis to determine which is the best point to do the EEG, but since we are treating chronic patients, the later the EEG is done, the more sure the result is. So the later stage we do the EEG, which is, well, we expected this result, but so there is less recovery in the later stages than there is in the beginning of the stage.
Danuta, could you go back to the graphical abstract of your fourth project that you presented, but in fact your second project, the one you did with the Belgians? So here you mentioned the need for standardization, further standardization, but it wasn't exactly clear to me what is it that you're trying to standardize and what are you going to achieve by that?
Well, we have more than, I think, 70 different EEG measures from this meta-analysis, and in use there are, that we use as clinicians or as scientists, there are like 20, 30. And then there are different methods to achieve these 70 different measures, the processing of the EEG, the pre-processing of the EEG, and so on and so on. And this is what is not standardized. And because of that, because the processing of the EEG signal itself is not standardized, the values can be very different from each other. And so the standardization is for that part of the EEG processing, basically.
So then in this case, doesn't it connect to your previous study about the difference between quantitative and qualitative assessments? Because even if this is the case, then the qualitative assessment is, okay, it's qualitative, but the quantitative doesn't seem to be very quantitative if there are 70 different ways to do it.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So this was taken into consideration during your study?
Yeah.
I have a question regarding this study also. Do you plan to do any subgroup analysis regarding the findings in imaging or maybe imaging or the patterns in the EEG found among those patients?
Yes, they are planning to do it to confirm the differences that we have found in the neurophysiological data with the neuroimaging data, but I've lost following the neuroimaging data, how are they doing in the last, I don't know, 4 months. But that was a plan, yes, before.